Hello, everyone. My name is Velina Chakarova. I am geopolitical strategist based in Vienna, Austria. And today I would like to talk about Korea, Ukraine, and the armistice logic of the new Cold War. There is a remarkable historical symmetry emerging between the first Cold War and the new Cold War, or what I describe as a global competition between two blocs centered around United States on the one hand and the dragon bear on the other, which is basically the China-Russia modus operandi of strategic coordination. The first major proxy war of the previous Cold War was the Korean War. It did not end with peace. It ended in 1953 with an armistice. The military confrontation was frozen. The political conflict was not resolved. The territorial division became permanent. External powers remained deeply involved, and deterrence replaced settlement logic. Now, think about today's geopolitics when I will make the parallel between Korea and Ukraine. 73 years later, we may be approaching a similar logic in Ukraine. Not because Korea and Ukraine are identical conflicts, certainly they are not, but because the international system may once again be incapable of producing a political solution and therefore settle for something much less ambitious, namely containment without resolution. So my point is the possibility of a new ceasefire instead of political solution for the Russian war on Ukraine, and that would include military demarcation lines, territorial disputes postponed rather than solved, and this will be the case with Ukraine given the long-term Russian ambitions to subjugate the whole territory and population and country. Security guarantees without final European security architecture, since the European security architecture is currently undergoing the most profound transformation given the transatlantic rupture, the new defense and procurement projects, as well as the geopolitical reality of not one but two proxy wars simultaneously happening in Ukraine and Iran. And NATO membership, of course, will be, at least for the time being, deferred, sanctions partially maintained, massive rearmament on both sides will continue. In other words, this could be the new armistice scenario for 2026-2027 period if we assume that both Russia and Ukraine would face a situation for different reasons where the benefits of summer or further ongoing offensives will no longer be felt by a large part of the population, respectively, if the political leadership decides that there are additional layers of variables that add pressure on decision making to start a new cycle of negotiations. And this is where the Korean Peninsula suddenly becomes much more important than the bilateral relationship between North and South Korea, which recently became once again very interesting highlight for media and analysts to comment on. It offers us a template for understanding how the first proxy war of the new Cold War between America and the Dragon Bear might eventually be terminated. This is the analogy I would watch very closely, and this is the base scenario I am currently using for the analysis of strong and weak signals or all key variables in the equation of the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine. The second reason Korea matters is that the peninsula is no longer a separate theater. And when we are discussing ongoing geopolitical issues, whether it's the Ukraine case or the Iranian case or the Taiwanese case, once again, we clearly see that there is an entanglement of key geopolitical hotspots on the global arena. That is perhaps the most important point that requires more attention on behalf of geopolitical experts. We are living also through what I've described as global system rupture, characterized by the simultaneity of crises. That means that since March 2nd this year, we entered the phase of a second ongoing proxy war in Iran, which adds accumulatively to the effects of the first proxy war being in Ukraine, and now with ongoing militarization of the Indo-Pacific region, with parallel developments happening around Taiwan and in the Indo-Pacific region, but also linked to critical raw materials, industries, supply chains, and key infrastructure. Well, we clearly see how this global system rupture concept, as such, becomes more and more relevant. Well, here, of course, the boundaries between theaters are increasingly disappearing. We saw this very clearly when Donald Trump linked the reduction of the ongoing Freedom Shield military exercise this year not only to his relationship with Kim Jong un, that means with the relationship with North Korea. And by the way, this annual military exercise, which is defensive in nature, is critically important for South Korea and for the interoperability between American and South Korean defense actors. But this decision has not only been linked to the relationship with Kim Jong un and his view that the exercises were provocative, but also to South Korea's refusal to participate in the American military effort against Iran. So, Europe, brace yourself for the upcoming autumn season, as not only the trade war portfolio with China will be on the plate, but also similar pushback on behalf of the Trump administration when it comes to the lack of any participation or any support for the ongoing war in Iran. And this is an extraordinary connection, in my view. A military readiness decision on the Korean Peninsula was linked to an entirely different conflict in the Middle East. This is precisely what I mean by the simultaneity of the crises, and the entanglement of the key hotspots on the global arena. Hormuz arrived in Korea in the form of a political decision. A South Korean alliance commitment became part of American leverage in another theater. And this creates an important precedent because Washington's allies are watching very carefully whether security guarantees, military exercises, and consultation mechanisms are becoming conditional upon their behavior elsewhere. But I think that there is another dimension to Trump's approach toward North Korea. I do not interpret the current signals primarily as another attempt at the kind of spectacular diplomacy we saw back in 2018. Remember the whole narration about the Rocket Man and the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong un? The strategic environment is completely different almost 10 years later. North Korea today is much stronger geopolitically and geoeconomically due to the security deal and the military ties with Russia, but also due to the deepening economic and trade portfolio with China. It has nuclear weapons, a vastly more developed missile arsenal, growing military industrial cooperation with Russia, and crucially, battlefield experience from the war in Ukraine. Let's not forget that North Korean soldiers have fought on behalf of Russia in the Russian war against Ukraine, and Russian military aid, and North Korean military aid has been constantly shipped to Russia to support its war effort against Ukraine. Russia has become North Korea's direct military partner. China remains indispensable to its economic and diplomatic survival. Pyongyang is therefore embedded much more firmly in what I describe as the Dragon Bear's wider shadow network. Kim Jong un no longer needs Washington in the way he did 7 or 8 years ago. That explains something that otherwise looks puzzling. Trump can make conciliatory gestures without receiving immediate reciprocity. In fact, the North Korean reaction after the announcement that the military exercises between the United States and South Korea would be halved in terms of the duration was quite striking, namely by being absent. From North Korea's perspective, there is no urgency to react or to give any concessions whatsoever. The geopolitical balance has changed, but from Washington's perspective, there is a certain urgency given the new reality with the ongoing war in Iran. The United States is simultaneously dealing now with Iran, to a certain extent with Russia, consider the mediation efforts on the Russia-Ukraine portfolio so far rather failed. And then, of course, the bigger, so to say, portfolio linked to China, consider the summit in Beijing in May when Trump and Xi Jinping met, and now consider the second leg of the bilateral trip agenda, which is which goes back to the plans of Xi Jinping to visit United States and meet with Trump. So, against this background of rather fluid geopolitical events and developments, there is also the increasingly unstable nuclear environment, the the dynamics of conventional and nuclear rearmament around the globe. And all of this is having an additional accumulative effect on the decision making from American perspective. And here I think Trump's broader nuclear strategy becomes relevant too. He has repeatedly expressed the desire to bring the major nuclear powers into a new arms control framework. He has spoken about Russia and China. He wants another personal channel to Kim Jong un. He certainly doesn't want to see the activation of the nuclear card right now in the Indo-Pacific. That means that North Korea could feel emboldened to kind of accelerate and aggravate, in fact, the nuclearization in the region by, for example, conducting more nuclear tests. And at the same time, the old architecture of nuclear arms control has been disintegrating, while China, at the same time, has been rapidly expanding its arsenal, both conventional and nuclear one, while Russia has been modernizing its forces. So this is a new reality which kind of reflects also the environment of the new Cold War, where understandably the basically both sides, both blocks are in a mode of rearmament and boosting their defense portfolios. But at the same time, it is critically important as North Korea is also increasing both its warheads and delivery systems, and Iran has returned the nuclear question to the center of international security. And so far, we did not get the impression that Iran would comprehensive use to build a nuclear weapon. These, in my view, are relevant topics that need more consideration. It is, in fact, no longer the bilateral nuclear world of the United States and the Soviet Union. If we go back to the historical parallel of the 50s, it is increasingly a multipolar nuclear system without a functioning regulatory architecture. And I believe Trump wants to start addressing this issue, also because there is a potential for certain, let's say, confidence building measures, communication, military to military communication, diplomatic channels, which can be settled directly with both China and Russia. Again, the sign of the times, if we consider the previous period of the First Cold War, which was basically the case to avoid, for example, scenarios of miscalculation. But that always happening not because Trump or anyone else from the administration is suddenly embracing traditional arms control diplomacy. It's more because Trump's instinct is transactional and highly hierarchical. He wants to get the leaders who control the arsenals into direct negotiations and direct communication, and to establish some form of restraint at the top. I describe this state as a state of managed confrontation. That means that while both sides are meanwhile overtly admitting to the reality of a new global competition in the geopolitical domain regarding proxy wars and participation in third parties conflicts, in the geoeconomic domain, where we are meanwhile in a situation of weaponization of everything from commodities, raw materials, critical infrastructure, semiconductors, important industries, to the geotechnological domain, with the fourth industrial revolution now shaping the decisions of United States, China, middle powers, and everyone else around the world to try to not just to ride the wave of this new industrial revolution, but to more or less become victorious and emerge victorious out of this fourth industrial revolution, where the mindset is that AI and AI-based technological breakthroughs will be on the top of the technological breakthroughs, and in that sense will be the game changer. Against this background of a highly volatile environment, there is this push to create certain forms and structures, which obviously will be new structures since the old organizations, institutions are no longer efficient in doing so. And these platforms and structures are supposed to create certain predictability, especially at the top of the system, where this triumvirate of global power politics between United States, China, and Russia is happening. What I describe as the triumvirate of happiness, where basically these kind of formats are used to create certain predictability in the bilateral relationships, certain stability in through dialogue forms, certain confidence building measures to avoid major miscalculations, but mostly I would argue for the time being to pull the global economy and trade from the abyss of the possibility of a fourth systemic risk driven global crisis due to the simultaneity of the both wars happening in Iran and Ukraine. In that context, the immediate objective toward North Korea may not be denuclearization at all. It may be more about pacification and keep the Korean Peninsula relatively quiet. Do not allow the activation of the North Korean card, the activation of another hotspot in a series of hotspots, because it will add additional geo-economic pain to the already hurting global economy. Also prevent Kim from activating another nuclear crisis, avoid forcing the United States to manage simultaneous escalation in the Middle East, in Europe, and in Northeast Asia, while Washington is also preparing for the much larger systemic competition with China, set the stage for the political dialogue with Xi Jinping, avoid any situation or miscalculation or an escalation of, let's say, certain trios or nuclear based tests could, let's say, add to the already quite insecure situation on the ground. This would make North Korea less separate diplomatic project and more variable inside the much wider strategic equation. This is where China enters, in my view. The timing of Wang Yi's visit to South Korea is extremely important. It has been the first visits in the last 5 years to South Korea. Beijing does not need Seoul to abandon Washington. That is neither realistic nor necessary. China needs South Korea to remain sufficiently autonomous to complicate consolidation of an American-led bloc in Northeast Asia. And that means lower, but also deeper, let's say, hybrid warfare toward American allies in the region, such as South Korea and Japan, with the aim to prevent any regional integration, especially in the field of defense, security and defense, in the direction of a possible Asian NATO. That is, of course, the absolute, let's say, worst case scenario from Chinese perspective. It means also discouraging South Korea from fully aligning with American technologies and with American sanctions or restrictions against China. It means preserving economic interdependence. It means trying to deepen the economic portfolio between South Korea and China, trying to balance China, actually, sorry, not balance China, but South Korea, to lure South Korea away from the American bloc. And above all, it means preventing the strategic geography of Northeast Asia from becoming completely bipolar. China does not have to win South Korea or bound South Korea to its dragon bear based bloc. It merely has to prevent Washington from having South Korea automatically or conditioning South Korea on geopolitical goals by the Trump administration in the region. And that is, in my view, an important distinction. South Korea is therefore not a peripheral actor in this new Cold War. It is one of its most important key players in terms of regional geopolitics. In fact, this new Cold War will have its epicenter in the Indo Pacific region with Taiwan, with Southeast Asian partners that are currently on the rise, but at the same time navigating between both blocs, and also, of course, with Japan and South Korea trying to boost their security and defense, not only within an American umbrella, but also for the sake of partial strategic autonomy. Geographically, all of this sits at the intersection of Chinese, Russian, Japanese, North Korean interests as well. Literally, it hosts American forces and is central to the deterrence architecture of Northeast Asia. Economically, it is one of the world's major industrial powers. Technologically, its position is even more important, especially for the American interests. South Korea sits at the center of the semiconductor ecosystem, and particularly the high bandwidth memory supply chain that is becoming indispensable for artificial intelligence. This makes Seoul relevant not only to the military competition in Asia, but to the technological competition amid the fourth industrial revolution. And if AI becomes this foundational source of economic, military, political power, if we assume axiomatically that it's the game changer for the fourth industrial revolution, where the mindset is that the winner takes all, then the countries controlling its critical infrastructure acquire disproportionate geopolitical importance, whether they like it or not. Think of the base case of Taiwan as well. Now, South Korea is one of these countries. That's clearly the case, and that means that even if there is a confidence breach tactically because of the interruption of the annual military exercise between the United States and South Korea, there cannot be any alliance breach whatsoever in the long term for the reasons I already explained. There is, however, a dilemma which Washington should not underestimate. The United States remains the guarantor of South Korean security. China remains one of South Korea's most important economic relationships. Russia is at the same time strengthening North Korea. North Korea remains an existential military threat, not only to its neighbors because of its possession of nuclear weapons, but meanwhile, nationally, because it's also providing significant military aid and human capital to a war that's taking place thousands of kilometers away from the Indo Pacific. And instability in the Middle East directly affects South Korean energy security as well. There is simply no comfortable position available to Seoul anymore, where a country of that kind of important position in the global geopolitical context can just step aside and do not actively participate in what's happening right now in global affairs. For years, middle powers were able to hedge and to exercise this kind of equidistance approach. That would mean American security on one side, Chinese economic integration on the other. The new Cold War is gradually eliminating this space. It's a slow but steady systemic process that takes place in all socioeconomic systems. Meanwhile, that means that both sides are asking for more alignment. Both global players will be demanding more engagement. But the likely South Korean response is not defection from the American alliance. It is about greater strategic autonomy, which within the umbrella of the one or the other player security guarantee is in fact even more required than ever. That would mean more defense spending, more indigenous capabilities, more diversification of economic and energy relationships, more caution about automatically joining American initiatives against China, especially given a specific context or a specific timing, and eventually, perhaps most consequentially, a much more serious debate about South Korea's own nuclear options. This is where the American attempt to reduce risks can become self defeating. If extended deterrence appears politically conditional, South Korea will have stronger incentives to reduce its dependence on extended deterrence. And China faces exactly the same paradox, by the way. Pressure from the Dragon Bear may produce not a more neutral South Korea in the future, but in fact a more militarily autonomous, and eventually more nuclear capable South Korea. That will be one of the great unintended consequences of the new Cold War, but it will be a consequence that would and should not surprise us given the nuclearization as a result from the first Cold War. Consider the nuclear proliferation and the fact that more countries acquired the nuclear weapon during the first Cold War. So that brings us back to Ukraine. Because North Korea now connects the two conflicts directly, the country that fought the first proxy war of the previous Cold War is now militarily involved on Russia's side in what I describe as the first major proxy war of the new Cold War. China, which participated in the Korean War through the Chinese People's Volunteers and was part of the 1953 armistice architecture, is today Russia's indispensable strategic partner. The United States remains the principal external power behind Ukraine and is currently trying also to play the role of a key mediator, but it's not the only mediator, given the fact that also Gulf countries, as well as Turkey, have participated in various forms of mediations. The constellation is obviously quite different, but the structural logic is striking. The Korean precedent demonstrates how great powers terminate a war they cannot politically resolve. What do? They freeze it. And we saw this happening in the past. Consider, for example, the frozen conflicts in Eastern Europe. And this may become increasingly attractive in Ukraine as a possibility due to the lack of an ultimate political settlement. Not because Washington, Moscow, Beijing, or Kiev suddenly agree on the political future of Ukraine. They clearly do not. But because at some point the systemic costs of continuing the war may outweigh the benefits of trying to impose a final settlement, especially against the background of global system rupture scenario that is currently happening because of the simultaneity of both wars in Ukraine and Iran. That is precisely what an armistice is designed to do. It separates the requirement to stop fighting from the requirement to solve the political conflict. And in an increasingly fragmented international system, that distinction may become extremely useful. My broader assessment is therefore that what we are currently seeing around the Korean Peninsula is not simply another cycle of tension, and detente between North and South Korea, even though we should welcome the political signals coming from South Korea to start a dialogue on a possible political settlement. By the way, North Korea did not react to this proposal in any way so far. It is part of the restructuring of the new Cold War. Trump is trying to manage several fronts simultaneously. Xi Jinping is trying to prevent the consolidation of an anti Chinese bloc in Northeast Asia predominantly, but of course is also using the opportunity to create narratives and ideological bias in the so called Global South, which is strongly anti American in its nature. Putin and Russia are binding North Korea ever more closely to Russia because it serves the tactical and operative goals in the war, given the fact that Russia receives cheap ammunition and military components, as well as thousands of North Korean soldiers who are easily deployed in, let's say, war zones, which can where Russian soldiers can be spared. Now, Kim Jong Un is converting nuclear weapons military cooperation and strategic geography into geopolitical leverage, and South Korea is discovering that its position between American security and Chinese economic gravity is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. None of this means that a grand bargain already exists between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. The grain bargain is a process that has just started, is happening, and that is the reason why I call it the triumvirate of happiness, to use an analogy from the cinema industry. But there is no evidence for a grand bargain, for a big compromise yet between these two blocs or between these three most important global powers. There is something much more important than any secret agreement, in my view. There are converging incentives to stabilize a system that is becoming dangerously overloaded. Again, think of global system rupture. And if you want to know more about it, just go on my Substack and find all the freely available analysis there, as I've been following the events and have been developing this concept since March 2 this year. And when systemic stabilization becomes more important than political resolution, armistice becomes attractive once again. That is why I would watch Korea very closely. One reason in terms of the base scenario in Ukraine, which would mean that second half of this year, ahead of another severe winter season, might be a window of opportunity for the South North Korean armistice model being, so to say, agreed on by Russia and Ukraine. And I would follow Korea very closely, not because the next Korean War is inevitable, quite the opposite, because the settlement of the last Korean War may tell us something about how the first major proxy war of this new Cold War is eventually could eventually end. The Korean War stopped in 1953 without being solved. Ukraine may be moving toward exactly that direction. That would mean not an ultimate peace, and not an ultimate reconciliation short term, and not a final political settlement, but the geopolitical arrangement designed to prevent the war from destroying the system around it. That may be the real significance of the Korean Peninsula today. For more on the other two important hotspots, especially now in the second half of the year, considering Iran, as well as the Indo-Pacific, where I will be going in autumn, there will be more videos. Thank you very much.